Hi everyone, it's Bobby from Dig Coding here, and welcome to Module 3 of my Django REST Framework course. I'm not wasting any time on this intro, so let's jump straight into it. And welcome to Module 3. So last two videos were all about intros and building a Django app to get to the point where we're ready for DRF. We did some DRF configurations, but in today's video, we will be tinkering in our core app. So we'll be building models and serializers and views so that actually we've got our very, very first endpoint. Okay. So before I start, just drop me a like and a comment so I've got some feedback. I love feedback. It leads to me creating these courses, and also subscribe and click the bell so I'm notified every time. You're notified every time I add a video. I don't edit these videos, can be clunky. So, okay, right, so we've done module 1 and module 2. This is module 3, and we'll be doing models and serializers and view sets and stuff. So look at my screen here. You can see I've actually already got my server running from the last video. Go into steps, go into module 3, click preview, okay? Assuming you're on VS Code, okay? So the configuration of our directory should look something like that. I'm not going to walk through that too much. Just pause, have a look, make sure we're not missing anything. If you are, go back to a previous video and you'll be caught up. Or you can pull down from GitHub. You've got the commands here. So CD into the root directory, fire up the virtual environment. We've already got that running because my server's running there, so I don't need to do that. Okay, in the last module, we can construct wired up 2 new applications. We didn't, we only done 1. Do excuse some of these typos, but building these courses are a pain. You obviously need to build them, then write the walkthroughs, and then test the walkthroughs, and then things slip through the net, right? So we only actually fired up the core app. When I first did this, it was core and e-commerce. So one app. We're now about to create our first API endpoint. So nice and simple. We want to contact us endpoint. So a user can send a name, email, and message to our backend. So imagine this is a standalone API. A client uses the contact endpoint. This is probably the use case is probably a better one to think that we're using a React single page app, right? So the React app has a form, contact us form, and it spits the form details to the backend, and then you process it. Okay, so that'll be a contact endpoint. A URL will be /contact. Okay, we want to capture this information. You capture the information in a database. Django uses models. That's kind of database language. It has a load of model database APIs built into Django. It's really, really powerful stuff. If you like, I've done a course on Django previous to this. Have a look if you're interested. So model is to capture and store the incoming data. We use a router to construct the URL. So we're going to have an endpoint of /contact. Okay. We use a serializer to process the data coming from the user and then send information back to the user. So I suppose a serializer in the Django REST framework world is kind of similar to a form in Django. A form in Django is a way of handling information from a user. It validates it and it sends it to the view, and the view then handles it, saves it to a database, and then responds with a message, a success message. So very much like that. So a serializer is handling incoming data. You can validate that information and it spits information back. So that's what we'll be creating a serializer for. And then we'll be using a view to encapsulate the common REST HTTP method calls. Common method calls would be a get, a put. So a get would be a getting information, retrieving information. A put request would be an update. Or a get request could also be a list. So it's a retrieve full list. You can do a post request, which would be to create a new instance in the database. So Django REST Framework has a lot of this built in. We can use view sets, which very much like Django again, has a lot of power. They cover a lot of the common methodologies and functionality that we'd want from a get request or post request to put request. Okay, so we don't need to do much code, but the view is what handles that. In the same as a Django view, it handles the request itself We use a serializer to handle the validation of the information. We use a router to point the request to the correct place, and we use a model to save information to a database. Okay, and that's easy, right? So let's go ahead and build our first model. Okay, so let's take this information, go into our core app, go into models. I know what I'm doing, and this is all in the instructions. I suppose I could. There you go, model. Go ahead and open core models.py and paste the following code. Okay. So what have we got here? Let's expand on that a little bit. So straight away, we're importing models. This is all Django stuff, so it's not really DRF, but we want a way of capturing the data. So you need to understand what we're doing. We're importing from utils, which we haven't built yet. So this is going to be an abstract model that we build in the next point that adds an ID field to each and every model that we use, and it will be a UUID. Okay, so I like to do that, especially when I'm building APIs. Okay, we're using Django extensions because we use abstract models that they have. One called a timestamp model, which adds a created and an updated field, I believe. We have an activator model. This has a status and 2 date time fields that let you know when things were activated and deactivated. Very, very handy. And then you have a title description model, which will add a title field and a description field. The reason we're adding that to our model is because we want a name and we want a message. Well, that's a char field and a text field, right? So by using a title description model, we have a char field and a text field. And what we need to do in a serializer and a view is just point the serializer to the right field. So that's why I've decided to do it, because you can see how to do it. You can select what the source of the data is for that particular field name that we construct in the serializer. So bear with me on that. There's method to my madness. Model is called contract. Got a timestamp, activate, so it's all inheriting from this stuff, and then we're passing through models. So normally that would say models.model, but this is going to be a model abstract that we'll create in the next point. We have a meta class. This is where you have ordering and things like that, or you can have a verbosity name. It's called contracts. You can call it my contracts, but that's the name that will appear in the admin page. We have an email field. So we want the user to send an email. It will be an email field in the serializer also. And then we have a DunderString method, which is the string representation of this particular model. Okay, so that's all we're doing. Save that. Go back to preview. Let's create the abstract model. So we want to create a utils file in backend and a models_abstracts.py file. So that's what we're doing now. Okay, and I'll copy this. Go to backend, new directory, we'll call this utils. You want another file in there called underscore or double underscore init.py. That's our constructor. Without that, it won't work. New file, and we want to call this model abstracts.py. Okay. And you could have a whole bunch of different model abstracts in here. I'm using ID, but you could have and it is active. You could have whatever field you want, and you can just build it in here, and it just allows you to inherit that in your models. So okay, we've got import UUID, which is a Python package, not a Django package. We've got models from Django.db import models. That's where we're inheriting it there. And the ID field, which comes straight out of the box normally, we're calling this a UUID field. So this is the primary key field for our model, and this is an abstract model. So that's what we're doing now, okay? Serializers. We will need a new file in core called serializers.py. So serializers allow complex data such as query sets and model instances to be converted to native Python data types, okay? So you can imagine it takes a database entry and converts it into data types such as lists, dictionary, string, boolean, sets, floats. Yeah, you get my drift. Okay, and can then be easily rendered into JSON or XML or other content types. Okay, so once you've got it into a data type Python style, you can then render it to JSON and spit it back to the client. Okay, and equally you can accept JSON and convert it into Python data type. So that's what the serializer is doing. It's kind of a middleman. So it takes in data, does a whole bunch of funky stuff to it, and then it either spits it to your database or it spits it back to your client. In this case, it could be React, your front end, okay? Serializers also provide deserialization. I've kind of roundabout way just explained that. So go ahead and create a new file called serializers in core and then paste the following code. Let's go ahead and grab that. Go into core, new file, serializer.py, and paste. What are we doing? So from dot, so it's relative, right? So we're importing models, import models. Okay, so all the models in models are imported. If you wanted to import just a specific model, you would say from dot models import, and you'd name the class contact. From REST framework, import serializers. Okay, so that's one of the files in REST framework called serializers. Within serializers, we've got a whole bunch of different classes that we can inherit from, and one of them that we're inheriting from is model serializer. It's a model serializer because this is serializing directly from a model that we've got, in this case called contact. REST framework.fields import char field, email field. Okay, so we're calling this contact serializer. It's just a class, same as what you do with a form, okay? Name, email, message. They're the three fields that we want to receive from a user. Name, email, message, or name, message, email. Now, we haven't called them that in the model. So if we tried to use this and we didn't pass through a source keyword, it wouldn't work because we've got a title and description field in the database. So what we want to do, we want to point these fields to the correct place. So in this case, name becomes title, message becomes description. Required, true. Now that's important. These are required fields. In the database, they're not required, especially the description. The description is not a required field, but we want this to be a required field from our user, and we return that back to them. Okay, so these are all required, true. And then at the bottom here, because this is a model field, a model serializer, class meta, we pass through the model. In this case, is models.contact, remember? Contact. And then we pass through the fields. Now this is what will be this is what gets deserialized back to the user. Am I saying that right? So the response that they get in the data keyword will be a name, an email, and a message. Okay, so that's what we're doing there. This is kind of a class that we're using to take in data, process it, spit it back to the user. Great. All understood. Clear as mud. Okay, view sets. Okay, now how can I explain this? So within Django REST framework, like Django, you have a whole bunch of functions and classes that you can call upon. Really, really powerful stuff. View sets especially really good. They allow us to inherit some common functionality. So with a GET request or a list to retrieve a list of information, you know, some of that functionality is easy enough. So when you're retrieving, for instance, if you give it a primary key, Django REST framework will automatically filter a query set and look for a primary key. You don't need to tell it to do that. It just automatically does it, okay? Obviously, that functionality sometimes doesn't work for your use case or your particular view set. So in which case you then extend them, or you use a different type of view set. So or an API view. Okay, you construct it in a very similar way as you do views in Django, except capitalize on the code that's already written, right? There's no use double-handling things. There's no use reinventing the wheel. Use the most powerful pre-written functionality in Django REST framework that gets the job done. That's what I say, right? View sets. So we'll be adding all this into views.py, okay, in core. Take all this information, copy, go into views, Control A, Control V, and save. Okay, we're importing JSON decode error. We're importing JSON response because we can construct a unique response by doing that. We're importing contract serializer that we've just written. We've then got from Django REST framework, we're bringing in parsers. We get view sets and status, and then we're getting a response itself from Django REST framework. Don't worry too much about all of this. Really want to know what it's doing. One way of doing that is to go into the virtual environment that we've got fired up. If you're not in the Docker way, go into lib, go into REST framework, and you know we've inherited from serializers. This is what we're looking at, right? We've imported all of this code. See that? Loads going on. Now what you can view is model serializer, right? So find model series. It's there. Actually, it'll probably be class. There you go. So when we're inheriting model serializer in a serializers.py file, this is what we're bringing in, right? So serializer file mapping. So all, don't need to go through this, but this is what it's doing. When I say bedtime reading, this is what I mean. Understand the class. Understand that has it got attribute, has attribute. Postgres fields. So it maps the thing. Read this. It's really powerful stuff, and this is why it's so popular. Okay. So if in doubt, when it says REST framework import serializers and then serializers.model serializer, just have a look at what we're doing. Okay. But where were we? So yeah, import view sets. Okay, go back in here. Where are we? View sets. That's what we're importing. Okay. Okay, we're then constructing a view set. So contract view set. View sets dot generic view set. Okay, so we're just inheriting from that class. That class gives us access to create, get. Let me actually look. Let me go in here and let's search view sets. Okay, right. View sets. Django REST framework allows you to combine the logic of a set of related views of a single class called a view set. In other frameworks, you may also find conceptually similar implementations named something like resources or controllers. Controllers, I think, is Jar. A view set. So, okay, this is the common logic. Okay, so get, post, list, create. So a list would be a get request with multiple responses. A get request would be specifically one instance from the database. Create would be a post request. Okay, you're creating a new instance in the database. Okay, so when the reason I looked at that is because this particular view set we're only creating. Okay, we're not retrieving, we're not getting anything. We will in the e-commerce app, and because we're only creating, rather than just having a couple of lines of code, I've actually written a create function, which is very similar to what's already in the generic view set. Generic view set requires us to have a serializer class stipulated here in the class itself. So we're using contract serializer, and then we've got a method called create. Okay, so pass through self and request. So this is the request itself. And then we have a simple try and accept. So we tried to do this code, and in which case we pass the JSON data. So we use the parser that's built into Django REST framework. Pass JSON, pass that data through to the serializer. The serializer in this case is expecting a char field, an email field. It's pointing it towards the database for the field's title, description, and email. Okay. If it's valid, in which case, we know if we're passing the right sort of information, it will be valid. An invalid request would be an email field that is not, it doesn't have an @ symbol, for instance. If it's valid, we save, and in this case, same as a Django form or model form, when you save the instance of the form, it saves it directly to the database. That's exactly what we're doing. Okay, so you call save on the serializer, and then you respond with the data from the serializer, which would be the new instance in the database. Okay, that's what we're doing. Else, if it's not valid, we pass back the error message with the status, and from the status that we're importing here, you have something called HTTP 400 bad request. So we give that response back to the user so they can then see why it's failed. That error would say email field is required, or email field must be an email type. I don't know what the exact terminology is, but that's what the response would be. If the parser fails, so we're sending through something that's not JSON, in this instance, they'd get result error, and the message would be JSON encoding error with a status 400. Now, I could also pass through something similar, right? You could do that, but we're not. Okay, and that is it. That's the view. Okay, last thing we've got left to do. That doesn't like that because we had an error in the code. You might have the same thing. Don't worry about any of that. That's not in the instructions anyway. So close the views, close down view sets, serializers, init, that one and that one. Next point is your URLs and routers. Okay, so some web frameworks such as Rails provide functionality for automatically determining how the URLs for an app should be mapped. to the logic that deals with handling incoming requests. Django REST framework adds support for automatic URL routing to Django. Okay. So Django URL patterns, this is where we're using the default router. Okay, and then we're same as we did in the URL conf in video 2, module 2. We're using the default router again, and then we're registering a new endpoint. We're adding that to URL patterns within the URL conf file. I forgot I'd done it this way. Sorry, I thought I'd done this in the actual core app. I'm not. I'm doing it slightly different. So you can register these URLs in the default router to each individual app, which is the right thing to do. However, I haven't done it in this. Or you can just register them all in the URL conf, which is exactly what I've done here. So copy, go back into core, no, DRF course, go to URLs, and we're replacing this. Difference, we're importing the core views, and then we're registering router.register contact. So that's the endpoint. Core views, contact views is the view name. So when a user makes a request to / contact, the router is pointing it to a Django URL view, which is called contact view set, which we just created in views. Base name is contact. So this is what the new endpoint will look like. Okay, save that, go into preview, and then we register. So let's go ahead and register our new model. Core, go into admin. Created a model in Django, you normally register it so you can access it in the admin page. And you can see here we're bringing in contact from models, and we're saying display the ID, title, description, and email in admin. That's all we're doing there. Nothing, it's not really DRF, so let's not dwell on that too much. And then we need to migrate our changes, and we should be good to go. We'll be ready to then make a call. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so have I called that the right one? Let's go CLS. I might have an error. Let me have a look. Model abstracts, what do I call it? Abstracts, there you go. Rename abstracts. Now it will work. You probably can't see that very well. So let's go CLS. We'll go migrations. What that's gone and done is it's created a migration file here. So this tells the SQL database what that particular table needs to look like, what the fields are, and so on and so forth. So here the operation is to migrate, create a model. It's called contact, and it gives it all these different fields. Remember, we're inheriting from Django extensions. We've got ID, which is a UID field. We create that ourselves. We've got created and modified. These are from extensions. This is the activated one, I think. And we've got time and description. We've got status, activation date, deactivation date, and an email. Okay, so we've got one line of code in our model. It's there. But what we get by inheriting from Django extensions, all of these different fields that we can access. Okay, go back in our terminal. We'll go Python manage.py migrate. Now I'll commit that to the database. Okay, and now we go Python manage.py run server. Okay, if we visit that, and if we go contacts, it won't like this, but it should have contact view set should either include a query set attribute or override a get query set. Yes, because this there is no get request. There is no get. There's no query set. We're not using it as a query set. We're using this as a post request, so we've only got to create. Now, in an ideal world, because we're using the view set, we're inheriting from the view set, we've automatically got those because we haven't sold it what the query set needs to look like. You're doing an error. This isn't a production ready app, so I won't worry too much about that. But the endpoint is there. You can see we are referencing contact view set. So the request is coming in, the router is pointing it towards our view. Okay, we're hitting an error before the serializer, so no errors there, no dramas. Okay, well that's working. What is it now asking us to do? So we can now create, we can now call the endpoint. Okay, so we've got this here. curl. We're using curl, or you can use this command here, which is HTTP. So HTTP is the request. Sorry, the name of the request, HTTP. This is the endpoint. I'm using Docker. I will be using Docker, right? So what we'll do, we'll close down my terminal there. We don't need that any longer, but we do need Docker. So I've got Docker open on my local machine. And to fire up Docker, what we need to do is cd back to DRF course. Okay. We now, this isn't a Docker tutorial, by the way. We now have access to Docker Compose, okay, and it creates two containers, Docker API and Docker. So it's an API and an app, okay. So we go Docker Compose up the double hyphen build. What that'll do, that will now fire up two containers. This is one of them. This is the other one. And it's looking for the Docker files that are already built into the app, which are in here. Okay, so you've got your Docker files here. Okay, so that's what it's doing. If you really want to understand Docker, I have done a couple of videos on it. We're firing things up, making some migrations, and with any luck, if I open up, it's not very big, but we've got an app. Okay, that's working. Now the app, it's just this is a Flask app, right? I use Flask because Docker needs an executable, and the easiest and quickest way to fire up a local server is to use Flask. Django is a little bit more complex, so it's a very, very lightweight container, but it's got HTTP installed already, so we have access to that. And the API is this, okay? So it's trying to run some tests. The tests aren't in there yet, but we'll do that in another module. So this is our Django app, and you can see we've got the server running, okay? So with any luck, I've got to stop the server locally. If I update that, happy days, right? So this is still running. This is now running in Docker, okay? Good. Now what we can do is so I apologize, it's not exactly big, but we go into our app, we click on CLI. What it does, it'll open up a little command line interface. What I'll then do is go back into our preview mode, and I'm going to pick up that command, copy. What that's doing, you can see there, it's calling API 8000. It's not localhost or 127.0.0. It's not that. This is the name of the container in Docker, which is called API. So that is the host name, /contact. Name is Bobby Stearman, message is test, and email is bobby@dicoding.com. That's the request. Okay, go in here, dump that in there, press enter, and it's saying it's worked. Okay, so this is the response that we're getting. So we get an JSON response with a data keyword. Within that, we've got attributes, we've got email, message, and name. And within that, we've then got a UID. So this is an ID in the database that we've created. There's an instance now with an ID of 5F3352, and it's got a message, test, name, and email. Now, if I change this request, oh, sorry, I do apologize. Press up. It's not going to let me. I'm going to have to paste this back in again. Now, I'm going to test this. I can't remember if I tested this or not. But I'm going to change email just to the letter B. Press enter. There you go. Enter a valid email address. Can you see that? There you go. So the serializer has worked. Okay, so it's accepting in a request from HTTP with a JSON or Python dictionary, which has been serialized, with a name, an email, and a message. Now, if you send all of those in this correct formats and this correct data types, it will work. If you send an email with a string, which is not an email, it will spit a 400 back to the user. It's exactly what we were looking to do. Okay, so if I go back here now, they're all required equals true. So I go back here now and remove email completely. Press enter. 400. Can you see that? So required. This field is required. I mean, you could write some exceptions. So you could actually sort of say, look, if email's ignored, I'll say that you got a source that data attributes email. So we're saying email needs to be there. If I was to then change that again, and change that to email bobby@didcoding.com, but that it will then say attributes message, so the message is required. Okay, so that's worked nicely. Like I say, you can make these calls. You know, if this was just curl in your local machine, you can call localhost 8000, it should work. But like I said, I'm using Docker. I find it a lot more fluid and easy to use. So that's it. That is module 3. Hope you've enjoyed it. That was quite fun and it all worked, which is always good. Now, if you could like and add a comment, that'd be fantastic. Also subscribe and click the bell so every time I add a video, you're notified, and it helps me build this channel. So the more response I get from you, the more chance there is that I'm going to be here in a year, 2, 3, 4 years time. So thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in module 4.